Hi everyone, this is just going to be a really quick video comparing the cool grey alcohol markers in Copic Sketch, TOUCHNEW Sketch and Winsor and Newton brush markers. So really quickly, let's start with the obvious, the actual barrel. The Copic Sketch and the TOUCHNEW barrels are oval and they are both very similar. Personally, I actually prefer the white. The Winsor and Newton brush marker, on the other hand, you can see is not oval and it does therefore roll. It does have a little point on this cap that stops it at a certain point, which is better than nothing. But yeah, personally I prefer oval markers. And I nearly forgot to mention, on the top of the lids, the Winsor and Newton markers just have a sticker with quite small text on, whereas the TOUCHNEW and Copic have it printed on the lids. And same again along the side, so TOUCHNEW and Copic have it printed on, whereas the Winsor and Newton have a sticker that actually wraps around the marker, which you can see me just picking the corner of. There's not a lot in it, but I prefer the printed ones myself. So looking specifically at all these markers in the cool grey range, the Copic Sketch markers can be bought individually or you can buy a set of 12. So 12 in the cool grey range, which is quite a lot. The TOUCHNEW markers come in a range of 10 cool greys. However, you can't buy these ones individually, so you would have to buy them as part of a larger set. And last of all, the Winsor and Newton brush markers are available in 5 different cool greys. You can buy these individually. I bought them in a set of greys, which came with cool greys, warm greys and blacks. I have left the black out of this with the Winsor and Newtons because I haven't included the black with the TOUCHNEW or the Copic Sketch, so it seemed a bit more fair this way. So the difference in nibs between all these, the Copic Sketch or Copic Sketch, depending on what you want to call it, has a chisel nib and a brush tip. The TOUCHNEW markers have a broad tip chisel nib again, or a fine tip, also known as a bullet nib. And the Winsor and Newton brush markers come with a chisel nib and a brush nib. Not sure how well you can see that, but I'm just holding them together so that you can see the difference in size between the nibs. I would say the brush nibs are quite a similar size. Obviously the fine tip is smaller. The broad tip or chisel nib seems the same size on the TOUCHNEW and the Copic, but it actually looks a little bit wider on the Winsor and Newton brush marker. Okay, so all I'm doing now is I'm just going to test the 3 brands of markers and use this almost as a bit of a colour swatch or a bit of a blending chart, so you can see how I've marked in the numbers. So I've tried to mark it fairly clearly so that you can tell what's going on, and I am using the chisel nib for this just because all 3 of the markers have a chisel nib, so it's a pretty good way just to get consistent results. So I've started with the Copic marker ranging from C00 all the way up to C10, and I'm not too worried about getting a perfect blend on this. I just wanted to make sure it was the same with each marker. So I haven't spent ages blending these in or trying to get a perfect blend or anything like that. One thing that I noticed was that the TOUCHNEW markers seem to give out a lot of ink a lot quicker to the other brands, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it does depend on your workflow really. It might mean that your markers run out a bit quicker though. And I did press record for the Winsor and Newton brush markers, but my phone seems to have ignored me and not recorded it. So I've already done this bit on camera now. And the first thing you're obviously going to notice is the cool greys in the Winsor and Newton markers are not that cool. Now, since recording this, I have had a look online and I've seen that they do have an ice grey range, which I am assuming would be closer to the cool greys in the other brands. However, they don't even have those in the brush markers, so that's just the Pro marker version, which is the bullet tip nib. But according to the pack, this is still a cool grey marker. And some things you'll notice from this are that the Copic markers have bigger range of lighter cool greys. And what I mean by that is you can get closer to white than you can with the TOUCHNEW and the Winsor and Newton. The TOUCHNEW is not that far off though, but the Winsor and Newton is a little bit further off if I'm being honest. You can't really get much lighter than what you can see in the CG1 box there. And also with the darkest tones, I would say that the Copic markers C10 is the darkest of all the markers. TOUCHNEW is not too far behind again. Winsor and Newton, however, didn't quite get up there. I would say that was closer to a sort of Copic marker C7 maybe. So all I'm doing there is just going over it again to see if layering it makes it a little bit darker. And to be fair, it did get a little bit darker, but still probably not quite as dark as the others. So anyway, you can see those results on the screen. And next, I just wanted to use the markers on a bit more of a finished piece. So I've drawn out this image of Pidgey from Pokemon, because who doesn't love Pidgey, right? And I've drawn this out 3 times so that I've got one for each brand of marker to use. So I'm starting with the Copics here. So I'm using the brush nib here because I don't really draw with a chisel nib much myself. All three of the markers did seem to bleed just a little bit on this paper. This is a Strathmore Bristol board vellum, and using the brush did give a really good smooth finish. But because you do have 12 markers, although you don't have to use them all, it did seem to take me quite a while to get this done, because I just had so many markers to sort of switch between for this piece compared to the other brands. So this is the TOUCHNEW markers we're using here. You might actually notice in a second that I do bring the Copic marker one back in. That's just because I'm trying to match the colours up as close as I can. Again, 10 markers with the TOUCHNEW, so it's not that far off the Copic anyway. And with the TOUCHNEW markers, I'm using the bullet tip nib. Now, I did actually manage to get quite a smooth finish, especially on Pidgey's sort of chest area. So that's just using the bullet nib, but just using it in small circles. And I was genuinely quite impressed with that because I didn't think I'd get a smooth finish with it. However, it did seem to take a lot longer than using brush markers. So you can get a smooth finish, but it does take a little bit more time than a brush marker. And to be honest, I didn't spend as much time in other areas such as his wing and stuff, and it didn't give me a smoother finish. So the Copic one probably does actually look a little bit better. So in those areas, it actually came out looking a little bit more patchy on the TOUCHNEW. Although overall, they still seem pretty good quality for such cheap markers. And these pieces do have blending in, but I did do some of it as more cell shading to neaten it up a little bit. So last of all, onto the Winsor and Newton brush markers. So as we already know, there was only 5 of these markers, and unfortunately the number 2 and number 3 seem to be identical. I don't know if that's just mine that's a little bit faulty or if everybody has that, but it was a little bit of a pain. So these are actually a lot quicker to work with just because there are only 5, so it's a lot less messing around with things like that and searching for the right marker, and I did actually find that a little bit more convenient. That being said, to get certain areas a little bit darker, I did have to layer over them a few times, and that ended up taking me a little bit longer. Although the brushes are really similar on the Winsor and Newton and the Copic, I would say the Winsor and Newton felt a little bit different. It's hard to describe, and it might have been the paper, but it almost felt like it sort of dragged on the paper. It felt a little bit drier. The only way I can think to describe it is maybe just not quite as smooth as Copic markers. In terms of feel at least, the result seemed quite good though. And we already mentioned earlier it was difficult to get lighter tones on this, so highlights would be quite difficult. So the grey tone does actually look more like it's neutral or even a little bit warm in comparison with the other brands. I thought this tone looked pretty good actually, but it's not what I would have called cool grey. It might be because you work a little bit faster with a brush marker, but to me, using the brush marker, especially with the lighter tones, seemed a little bit drier compared to using the bullet nib on the TOUCHNEW markers. But yeah, you are working a little bit slower with a bullet nib, so maybe that's why. And we're just going to take a quick look at pricing now. Bear in mind I am in the UK, and these are only rough prices at the time of making this video. We're going to be looking mainly at the price per marker. So the Copic sketch seems to start at roughly £5.20. That seems to be regardless of whether you buy it individually or as a set. Alternatively, you could get Copic Chow markers, which are very similar, but a smaller barrel and it holds a bit less ink, and they start at £2.95. TOUCHNEW markers range anywhere from 42p to 84p. It depends on the set that you buy them in. These are not actually available to buy individually though. If you were to buy the grey tone set, it works out at about 57p each, and that has a total of 30 different grey markers. And that set works out about £16.99 at the moment. The Winsor and Newton brush markers start from £2.20 to £2.50 individually. I have seen the grey set of 12 markers at quite a good price before, and it works out at about £1.50 per marker. But bear in mind only 5 of those are cool greys. So a super quick overview. I'll put the information on the screen and in the description box below as well. So starting with the price, Copic marker are obviously the most expensive by quite a long way, followed by Winsor and Newton, leaving TOUCHNEW as the cheapest. But as mentioned, you have to buy them as a set. The build, both TOUCHNEW and Copic are oval barreled with prints on, whereas Winsor and Newton have a more cylindrical barrel and just have a sticker wrapped around it. Nibs, both Winsor and Newton and Copic have chisel nibs and brush nibs. TOUCHNEW have chisel and bullet nib. Copic markers are the only ones that are refillable, and TOUCHNEW markers are the only ones that you cannot purchase individually. So the colour or the tone of these markers, TOUCHNEW and Copic are very similar, a really nice cool grey, whereas Winsor and Newton, not a bad colour, but not what I would call cool grey. So the range of greys in each marker is quite a lot, apart from Winsor and Newton only have 5. And as already mentioned in my set, number 2 and 3 seem to be identical. blendability, they all seem to blend really well, but with TOUCHNEW, it is a bullet nib instead of a brush, so it's going to be a little bit more difficult or take you a little bit longer to get that effect. But honestly, overall, all three of these markers are really good quality, and at the end of the day, it's just about your budget and your preference, maybe preference to nib type. So in my opinion, if you're not too bothered about a brush nib or you're on a really tight budget, I would start at least with the TOUCHNEW. If you want the highest quality and top of the range, I would say Copic do have a slight edge over the others, but you are going to be paying a lot more. So if money is not an issue and you want Copic markers, then that's great. But if you really want Copic and you're on a bit more of a budget, you could always get the Copic Chow markers. If you're on a budget and you want a brush marker, you could try the Winsor and Newton brush markers. For me personally, I'll probably get the most use out of the TOUCHNEW markers, just because I feel less guilty using them all the time, knowing they're a lot cheaper. But if I was struggling to get a smooth finish on maybe a large area, I might go then to one of the brush markers. Both the brush markers are great. I would probably use Copic though, just because I have them available. But honestly guys, any of these three markers are great to use, so try not to worry about it too much. And that's it for this video. If I've missed anything out or you want to ask any questions, just leave a comment below and I'll do my best to get back to you. And as always, please do like, share and subscribe for more content. Thanks so much for watching.